Just yesterday, I was discussing what the rest of somebody's existences would be like, what eternal destiny we have, and so on. And she said, well, she had a little experience as a little girl, and it was a fake Jesus. She don't believe in Jesus. And I said, well, what you believe in, what I believe in, doesn't matter, right? And so I told her, if you took the opportunity to follow instructions on how to drive, like triptych, AAA, from San Diego to New York City, specific spot to spot, and you followed every single instruction and tested out, and it came out perfect. You got just where you're going. Wouldn't you trust that? Wouldn't you trust AAA? Well, she said, well, I read the whole Bible. I said, well, you did. So I was going to ask her a question. She said, well, no, she quoted me 3 verses that were not even connected. They weren't correctly quoted anyway. And I said, well, the problem with that is you show evidence of not having believed and not having read. And then she just cut me off and left the bus. And that's her idea of reading the Bible. You read a smidgen here and a smidgen there, or you let somebody else tell you what it says, and you take their word for it without testing it out for yourself. The problem is, the Bible is to be interpreted by how do you read? The normative rules of language, context, and logic. You know when that started? Somewhere around the 3rd grade, grammar school, or maybe at home. Your parents started to teach you how to read, what words mean, and so on and so forth. So the Bible is to be interpreted by the normative rules of language, context, and logic. Upon careful examination of the Bible, it becomes evident that the authors who wrote every word exclusively utilized the normative rules of language, context, and logic. If you do use those rules without adding or subtracting, just like you didn't make up instructions that said, well, this triptych from San Diego to New York City, it says make a left at the second light. I think I could make a right at the light before this. And you end up in Mexico. Well, you say, well, there's something wrong with this AAA. You didn't follow their instructions. So in the absence of evidence, anywhere in the Bible or elsewhere, that it is to be interpreted with a specialized set of rules outside of what man, to whom the Bible was written, would normally expect, and in view of the evidence that a strict adherence to the normative rules of language, context, and logic produces the most trustworthy, non-contradictory, immutable, consistent interpretation, we must thereupon follow the writer's plan of how to interpret their work of the Bible. You may not agree with it. I tell people a lot of times, I don't believe what the Bible says until I've read each section, each chapter, each book, and draw my conclusions based on not what I think it should say, but what the author's words actually can be reported as saying. Seminary professor told me 3 most important things: observe and report. Point 2, observe and report. Point 3, observe and report. Don't add, don't subtract. One of the most important parts of interpreting the Bible, the 3, language, context, and logic, is context. He says 3 important things there: context, context, context. Who, what, why, where, when, and to whom. So if you're talking to somebody in the Old Testament, Israel, maybe that won't apply to you, maybe it will, but don't draw the conclusion. Maybe you want to find out if something similar or the same is in a passage like in the New Testament that provides the same information, so this applies to us too. In order for an individual to properly build an interpretation of the Bible, he needs to determine the meaning of one verse at a time in the passage in which it was written, and the order it was written by determining the proper context of that passage by the proper application of the normative rules of language, context, and logic to that passage. It's kind of boring, but boy, is it important, because I don't know how many times, and that's why I'm going to this, how many times I've heard people make statements wherever I go, and they completely make fools out of themselves because they say, well, this is what I believe. Well, we don't care what you believe. What we care is what do the words actually say, and are they credible within the framework of what that author wrote? Well, I never thought of it that way. Well, and if you skip around, cherry pick verses, you're going to come up with all kinds of bad information. Hence, he does not have to be the author, nor does he have to be a scholar, nor is there someone special, a pastor or teacher, through whom he must go in order to determine what the Bible is saying. Now, you might get some good advice, but check it out. You still, if he gives you advice beyond a correct reading approach, I would question it. In essence, this is simply a matter of applying one's own reading skills in a proficient, honest, and objective manner. Now, you may be corrected. Well, you didn't read that properly because you skipped in the middle of a passage. You skipped to the middle of a passage, and you don't know what it starts out with. On the other hand, it takes time and self-discipline to properly dig into the text, including making repeated efforts to check every conclusion one makes, especially those conclusions that others insist the Bible teaches. Most people, especially pastors and teachers, read into a text by going elsewhere in the Bible or by adding personal thoughts and conclusions that the text at hand does not warrant, instead of working hard and long to limit themselves to only what the text is saying by the normative rules. And how many people have told me, some pastors especially, that you read the passage and then you make application. Notice your personal idea of how this verse is to be applied to people in your congregation. Well, not everybody's the same. See, so, and if it doesn't give you that testimony, just let it lie where it is. That's why we have so many differing points of view about the Bible in so many denominations. Actually, the Bible is very clear if you take the time to study it thoroughly, one passage at a time, one verse at a time, one word at a time, by simply listening to what the author is saying and not by adding your own or somebody else's thoughts to it. You can have some thoughts. You might jot them down and put them to the side to see if they're verified. If the Bible doesn't address those thoughts, then guess what? It doesn't address those thoughts. Move on. If an author of one of the books of the Bible did not see fit to address a certain point you or someone else feels is important, you must put that thought aside and only listen to what the author is saying, because he was the one who wrote those words, and he hasn't told you or I to go anywhere else, any place else in the Bible or outside the Bible, to add those thoughts to his. Yes, you might argue that there are other passages that say more about a subject, but no one authorized you or I to be editors, so we are to be honest listeners only. Something elsewhere may be true, but in the text at hand it may not be in view. Now, I've done this, though, in studies. I've quoted a similar passage, but then I take the interpretation of that passage, and that passage alone, and see if they corroborate or don't. And you have to be very careful when you do that. Once one has done a thorough job of listening to what a particular passage is saying, then it is logical to go to other passages and thoroughly listen to them, and then compare them with the original passage via those normative rules of language, context, and logic, or of reading. But to jump around from one passage to another is to disregard the normative rules of language, context, and logic, to rush to conclusions to support one's own point of view. This is like cooking 10 meals at the same time without ever thoroughly cooking or preparing a meal. Just as one misses the point of the meals by ignoring the recipe instructions, and then you're testing out somebody else's recipe. You want to add to it, subtract? Well, if it doesn't taste good, maybe that's your problem. So one is missing what the Bible is saying by not paying attention to the normative rules of language, context, and logic. I've heard, how many times have you heard? You can't just take one verse in the Bible. You've got to know the whole Bible and what it says about it, so that you can interpret that one verse. So I go to John 3:16 within its context of John 1:1 through John 3:15 and a little bit further than that, 17 and 18, and you have an idea what it says. Yeah, but you have to learn what the rest of the Bible is saying. But that's circular reasoning. You can't understand what one verse is saying until you understand the rest of the Bible. But how do you understand the rest of the Bible without understanding one verse at a time? It's utter nonsense. You're never taught how that rule, that idea, and how to read. You don't pick up a book and read chapter 1 and then pick up another book by a entirely different author and read chapter 8 and go around and make sense of it all. So there are places to go in order to find out what words in the Bible can mean. Various study helps, such as interlinear Bibles of New Greek and Old Hebrew Testaments, commentaries on Greek and Hebrew manuscripts. Be careful, they have to follow the rules of language, context, and logic, and they digress so much. Hebrew and Greek lexicons, footnotes, cross-references, English dictionaries, Greek, Hebrew, and English grammar books, rules of logic, contextual, that takes work. You had to build up a library, studies on principles of logic and context, etc. But over the years, you can do this. And have some trusted people. Maybe have a good pastor in your church. I did. Berean Memorial Church in Irving, Texas. And he followed through, followed the reading. What were you going to get next week? When he left off the week before. And he digresses, repeats, only when it's warranted, right? And he shows you where he got his conclusions and repeats himself. And then you have the tape, the review, and then you have his house to go visit and ask questions. That's why he sent me to seminary, because I was interested in learning properly. These resources set the rules on how words in a translated or original language may be interpreted. Furthermore, selected commentaries, pastors, and teachers that by and large follow these rules may be used to suggest conclusions which one must then test out for oneself to see if they are in accordance with the normative rules of language, context, and logic. And what do you do with that information? You share it with others. I went to one church, and the pastor said, do not share what you know from the Bible with people in our congregation or elsewhere. You only talk to me. Wow. Did the disciples say that? No. Jesus told the disciples to go and spread the word to the world. Now, if they got it right or wrong, well, if Jesus taught them well, and evidently he did. Now, if you weren't taught well, you better make sure you are by reviewing and making sure what you're saying is a valid thing. Is it trustworthy? And then you have the person repeat back to you. I guarantee you the sessions that Jesus had with the disciples, he constantly criticized them because apparently they fed back to him and they get it wrong, so he corrects them. Manuscripts of the original and ancient languages, versions, translations of the Bible are not sources for the proper use of the rules of language, context, and logic. Neither do they provide all the available meanings for a word in the original or translated language to verify that the corrected word is in view, nor do they stipulate the rules of language, context, and logic somewhere in the text in order for one to be able to interpret the text properly, especially if some special rules apply. If one uses a Bible manuscript or translation or version as it were a dictionary, as if it were a dictionary, grammar book, or logic book, one is in effect relying on the writers, translators, for what they are saying and what one should believe, instead of determining for yourself in a proper reading skill set exercise what it actually is saying. The Bible should not be taken out of your hands or anybody's hands. If they have reading skills, whatever the level they are, they shouldn't be corrected to the point where they're told what they should believe that verse is saying. They should be taught what it's saying based on the rules of language, context, and logic. In view of the fact that there is so much disagreement on what the Bible says, including ancient manuscripts, versions, pastors, and teachers, it is mandatory that one study to show oneself approved, 2 Timothy 3:16, to do one's homework and test every conclusion by the proven method of the normative rules of reading, using the available resources mentioned above. There will be nobody at judgment to help one defend his or her point of view to God. It's up to one to verify everything one believes before one gets there.